And good morning, everyone. I'm Carla Wade along with Rick Carly. We are standing right now for live coverage of Congressman John Lewis's return to Washington. It has been a weekend of ceremonies and tributes honoring his legacy. This is one of the many services that have been planned over the weekend starting on Saturday. We are watching this scene here. This is at Joint Base Andrews, and you can see the plane there is where his body has landed. We are waiting for the casket to be taken off the plane and loaded into that hearse, which will then begin a motorcade through the city of Washington, D.C. this morning before he lies in state at the Capitol Rotunda. Rick and I have been sitting here this morning watching this all play out for about the last 45 minutes. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is there this morning, and she is one of the dignitaries that is arriving to meet that casket. We've also seen some people, of course, with all the COVID-19 restrictions going on right now this morning, there's a limited number of people there. Everyone is wearing masks, so it's been a little bit difficult for us to make out some of the dignitaries that are there at the moment as we await that casket coming off the plane this morning.
Yeah, let's give you a little bit of an idea of the agenda, what is going on. Of course, yesterday, the casket, just an emotional scene as it was wheeled across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. Now, of course, the body at Washington, D.C. But what will happen is there will be a laying of the wreaths. Nancy Pelosi and other dignitaries will greet that casket. It will be taken to the Capitol Rotunda. Now at 12:30 Central Time, about 80 lawmakers who have been invited by invitation only will be gathered inside the U.S. Capitol to view the casket. Among those, Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, Vice President Mike Pence, former VP Joe Biden. President Trump is not scheduled to be there this afternoon. That could change. We'll keep you posted on that, especially after our NBC folks join us. Later, that casket will be wheeled out into the outside steps of the U.S. Capitol. We're starting at 5 o'clock tonight. The public can view the casket, again, from 5 to 9 Central Time. Tomorrow, again, the public on the steps from 7 in the morning till 9 at night, long day. Same deal Wednesday. On Thursday, the body of John Lewis will head to Atlanta. Will be certain to be an emotional service there, after which interment and burial will follow. So again, as Carla mentioned, Mr. Lewis died, 10 days ago at the age of 80. And it has been a couple days already of honoring a legend, and more days ahead in doing the same thing.
Yeah, we should point out that I guess one of the first services was at Troy University. He is from Troy, Alabama, and honoring a native son there. And then, of course, that was Rick was talking about that poignant moment when his casket went across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma yesterday. Bringing to mind that time 55 years ago when he, as a young man, was there demonstrating for voting rights and was greeted by Alabama state troopers who cracked his skull. He almost died that day, but lived and then went on to serve 17 terms as a congressman out of Georgia. We should also mention that part of that motorcade, I'm looking at some notes here, will go past the Black Lives Matter Plaza in Washington, D.C. I'm reading USA Today saying that was one of the last places before he died that the congressman asked to go see the Black Lives Matter Plaza, obviously dedicating his entire life to that notion and to civil rights, one of the icons of the civil rights movement, and obviously probably inspired hundreds, if not thousands, of those young people that have been out demonstrating for the last several months for that particular cause. As we can see now, there are some people that are standing around. We can only assume that these are probably dignitaries, friends, family members. There will be a private ceremony for lawmakers, as Rick was mentioning. That's going to be at the Capitol sometime this afternoon. I believe that's about 12:30 Central Time. And it will be a private ceremony with lawmakers who will be there to pay their respects to the late congressman.
Yeah, something you just mentioned, Carla. You said he was a congressman for 17 terms. We're not talking 17 years here. We're talking 17 terms. His territory, the Northern District of Atlanta, But again, Representative John Lewis, born February 21st, 1940, down in Pike County, Troy, Alabama. You know, he always wanted to be a preacher, and legend has it when he was 5 years old, he started preaching to the chickens in his backyard. And then he obviously made his way 18, 19 years young up to Nashville, where he went to seminary. He was later ordained as a Baptist minister. And then he really started to make an impact. He helped organize the March on Washington in 1963. He was the last surviving member of the Big Six who organized that. 2 years earlier, in 1961, he was one of the Freedom Riders. Him and a bunch of buddies got in their car and drove from the nation's capital to New Orleans, Louisiana, trying to desegregate little towns that, of course, you mentioned. In 1965, on the march to Montgomery across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, he was beaten by state police, and you have seen the pictures. He really was hit hard, and that didn't slow him down. So really, 80 years old, dying 10 years ago, a true legend, and his impact on society, on this country, will never be forgotten.
Definitely, and then so much so that there will be a public viewing, as you mentioned, Rick, that'll be happening on the front of the Capitol steps. That'll be happening this evening and then all day tomorrow. I should note, though, that because of the unique circumstances that we live in right now during the COVID-19 pandemic, the family has asked that people not travel all the way to Washington, D.C. They anticipated that there might be lots of people who would want to pay their respects to Congressman Lewis, as you can imagine, but asking people not to make that extra effort to travel all the way to Washington, D.C. just because they're more concerned about public health, but saying that social distancing measures will be in place during that time, as well as people will be wearing masks as well, they pay their respects to the congressman. But you know, just a very difficult time for people who are wanting to be a part of this moment in history in order to do that.
Yeah, John Lewis suffered obviously tremendous victories, tremendous pain, tremendous personal loss. He lost his beloved wife Lillian 8 years ago, I believe, 2012, married to her for 44 years. And again, what I saw the other day, they had one of Mr. Lewis's younger brothers saying that, you know, through all this, he was still John. He'd still call the farm. He'd still call the siblings. Hey, how you doing? You know, we would see him in the Capitol, as we see in Congress, you know, doing what he did. And yet when he got home at night, he would always call the family, just make sure everybody was okay.
We also heard this weekend from his fraternity brothers. He was a lifelong member of Phi Beta Sigma fraternity, and many of them spoke yesterday in Selma, talking about that throughout his life that he was always an active member, and no matter what he had to do as a congressman, as a statesman, whenever he was called upon to do something for the fraternity, to speak to young people, to attend various conferences and things like that, that he was always willing to oblige when called upon. So it definitely speaks to how he never forgot his roots, where he came from, and continued to always to be there, to be that sort of example for younger people who looked up to him.
Really, for sure, for sure. And on the right of your screen, we just disappeared though, but what you saw was the Edmund Pettus Bridge yesterday when, like you said, poignant. That's a great way to put it, Carla. It was so emotional that they didn't have people walk with him. It was just him, his casket drawn by the horse across the bridge, no music, just you could hear some of the frogs in the background by the river.
And they scattered
Alabama sky.
Roses, I believe, rose petals there across the bridge to represent that day that, you know, as we know now, became known as Bloody Sunday. Those rose petals representing the blood that was spilled on that bridge in the fight for civil rights. But you know, I saw some of the postings on social media yesterday, and you could tell that it was very impactful to a lot of people who were sitting at home yesterday, either watching it streaming or watching it on their television screens. You know, that that image, that parallel of, you know, this time being saluted by Alabama state troopers.
And that was
going across that bridge.
And again, that scene on the left there, lower left, like you said, you just mentioned, Carla, it was really something. How popular, how big was John Lewis as a congressman in his home district? You mentioned the 17 terms. He garnered less than 70% of the vote only one time on election day, and that was back, I believe, in 1996. But when John Lewis was in Congress, he was going to be in Congress again and again and again. Very popular, great man, did some great things for the folks north of Atlanta, Georgia. And
as we wait for that casket to be loaded into that hearse, we should probably mention that there's also going to be another remembrance for Congressman Lewis here in Birmingham today. It's a virtual visual that had to be rescheduled from last week, and that'll begin at 6, and it will be streaming on social media from the mayor's page there.
1961, John Lewis, one of 13 original Freedom Riders. There were 7 whites, 6 blacks. They were determined to ride from Washington, New Orleans in an integrated fashion. We've seen some movies made about this before. And when I think of him, I just think of bravery.
And we've seen there in the left side of your screen, if you're wondering what that is, that's from a ceremony that was held here in Alabama at the Capitol over the weekend, where he also, his body was there for a service this weekend, another tribute of the many tributes that have been coming for the past few days. There's no shortage of those, and obviously well deserved. And there we now see his body being taken off of the back of that truck to be loaded into the hearse. And then that will begin that motorcade that will go through the streets of Washington, D.C. this morning. And arriving at the rotunda for that 12:30 Central Time viewing inside. And again, that will be attended by about 80 dignitaries, including Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and Vice President Mike Pence, former Vice President Joe Biden. At this stage, President Trump is not scheduled to be there, but we will keep you posted on that. And later this afternoon, 5 o'clock Central, 6 Eastern, that casket will go outside the steps of the Capitol where the public can view that until 9 o'clock tonight. And as you mentioned, former Vice President Joe Biden will be attending this ceremony along with his wife, according to his campaign. She will be traveling along with him for that. We imagine the Obamas might possibly be in attendance for any of the ceremonies going on in D.C. A lot of people may recall after President Obama's first election, there was a wonderful photo of him embracing Congressman Lewis. And I believe there's a story of a note that President Obama gave to Congressman Lewis, and I believe it, I'm paraphrasing here, said something to the effect of it was because of Congressman Lewis that he was able to become the first African-American president of the United States for all of the work that he did and the heavy lifting in the civil rights movement. Heavy lifting, that's a good way to put it there. You know, he said years ago that growing up in Troy, he was a little kid, he did not see a white person until he was 6 years of age. A family member took him up to Buffalo, New York for a trip, and he realized, whoa, there's a whole different world out here, and really kind of opened his eyes as far as how he was growing up. And went on from there, went back to the Troy area, and then, of course, eventually to Georgia, to Seminary, and boy, what a life it was. 80 years, and he passed away 10 days ago. A few more details about that ceremony that will be held with lawmakers as they pay their respects this afternoon. House Majority Whip Jim Clyburn from South Carolina will be the one giving the benediction. He is the highest ranking African American in Congress at this time, and he and Congressman Lewis met 60 years ago. And that was when they were both a part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee that in Atlanta, those young people that were very instrumental in the very early years of the civil rights movement. And that's how far back they go. And so it's appropriate that he will be speaking today at this memorial service for the congressman. A little bit of a different feel today too, Carl. I mean, music perhaps, but I doubt it. That casket will be in the rotunda. It's a time for people to sit and think and pray and reminisce and
think about the accomplishments and the contributions of this man over 80 years, a different feel today for sure. And once again, that casket, that body will be outside of the Capitol through Wednesday, when on Thursday it will be taken to Atlanta, Georgia for a church service and then the interment.
And once again, I was mentioning that Representative or Congressman Lewis's family, knowing that this would be a very impactful day for a lot of people who have followed his life and, because of COVID-19, asking them not to travel to Washington, D.C. for anything. But I should mention that they have said that they would appreciate lots of the remembrances on social media. That they have said feel free to share condolences and pictures and remembrances on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, and that they would be watching those, and those would be very important and meaningful to them.
Boy, I'll tell you what, as a former Baptist preacher, he could deliver the goods, couldn't he, Carlo? And he got up there in front of Congress, and boy, I'll tell you, he could lay it on the line.
Always passionate, always very eloquent.
Yeah.
When arguing really his point of view, I believe it's known as the conscience of the Congress. A lot of people look to him for a sort of a moral direction, and for serving so long and being known as such a public servant.
25 years old, he helped lead a march for voting rights, again in Selma. I mean, other marchers were met by those heavily armed state police. Hard to believe that, we know John Lewis we think of him in his elderly years, 75, 78, 79, 80, just weeks ago before he passed, but 25 years old he was when he was in Selma, Alabama, and there's the picture, Beck, in your lower left. Boy, I'll tell you, what a life, what a legacy.
Picture is on the cover of Time magazine right now, as a matter of fact, as a remembrance to the congressman. Once his body arrives there at the Capitol in Washington, D.C., Speaker Pelosi, as well as Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, will also be saying some words. There's going to be some sort of arrival ceremony, but once again, these are the times we live in. Typically, there would be more people there, but they're saying that this ceremony will be very small in size because of the social distancing restrictions. But Senator Pelosi, as well as Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, both expected to speak at that sometime this afternoon.
And on that subject, his family has urged people everywhere to perhaps organize what they're calling John Lewis virtual love events. And I like the name, and that says it all. They want you to get online, share some thoughts virtually about Mr. Lewis, what he did, and like you said, a different age, what with this COVID pandemic, but again, the family urging us, Americans everywhere, to do what they can do virtually to remember the legacy.
And there's some hashtags. Let me share that. That's what I was trying to remember a few minutes ago. I'm glad you brought that up again, Rick. These are the hashtags that if you want to share some of these virtual remembrances, the hashtag is beloved community and hashtag human dignity are the hashtags that they're asking the public to use in order to share these virtual remembrances of the congressman, or send your condolences using those hashtags, beloved community and human dignity. Also, if you would like to write some sort of tribute to the family, to let them know your thoughts on the congressman and the impact that he has made on your life, or that you feel he has made on our society, you can go to the JohnLewisLegacy.com. That has been set up for you to be able to send those remembrances about the congressman.
John Lewis, the first African American to lie in state at the Capitol Rotunda. As Carla mentioned, former VP Joe Biden will be there with his wife Jill, current Vice President Mike Pence with his wife Karen, Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, several dignitaries. President Trump not scheduled to attend at this point. That could change. We'll keep you posted on that. But again, that view lower left of the Edmund Pettus Bridge just yesterday, boy, certainly poignant, with more poignant hours to come as that hearse will make its way through Washington, D.C. and to the nation's capital.
That's right. And on the way, it will once again stop at the Black Lives Matter Plaza. That is one of the stops that is definitely scheduled to be on that motorcade. People telling news outlets that that was one of the last places before Congressman Lewis died of cancer that he wished to visit. And so family members and close friends took him by there just to be able to see that. I believe there was even a photo that was taken, if I'm remembering correctly, that made the rounds on social media of him standing there, particularly impactful image there. So that's one of the places that that motorcade will go past as it makes its way to the Capitol. And for that arrival ceremony, once again, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi will be there, as well as Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell.
You know, his fight against cancer was not along. When diagnosed with pancreatic cancer last December, with him passing away 10 days ago, what, that's 7 months. Look, he fought the fight, just like he fought so many other fights in his life. But that was tough to turn back. Again, passing away just 10 days ago at age 80.